The telegram arrived on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday, Grant Holloway had already told 3 men to make sure the woman never reached Cole Whitaker's ranch alive. Not because she'd wronged him, not because she'd stolen anything or said a word against his name, but because Grant had watched Cole's operation long enough to know that the one thing a stubborn, half-broken rancher needed more than water rights or good cattle was someone who believed he was worth fighting for. And the moment that happened, Cole Whitaker would stop being a man Grant could break. So Grant made the call. Quietly. The way he made all his calls. And then he went back to his supper like he hadn't just ordered the destruction of a woman who hadn't even stepped off the train yet. That was the kind of man Grant Holloway was. He didn't need a reason to ruin someone. He just needed a reason to feel safe. If you've ever stood somewhere you were never supposed to be, with nothing left in your hands and no voice left to call for help, then you already understand Evelyn Carter before she says a single word. This is her story, and it will stay with you. Subscribe to our channel and follow this story all the way to the end. We release new stories every week, and you won't want to miss what comes next. Hit the like button and drop a comment with the city and country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The rain had been falling for 6 hours by the time the westbound train pulled into Granger, Montana, and Evelyn Carter was the last passenger still sitting in her car. Not because she wasn't ready. She had her suitcase packed, her hat pinned, and her baby boy, 11 months old, with a thin ring of dark hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything without blinking, wrapped against her chest in a wool blanket that had belonged to her mother. She was ready. She had been ready since St. Louis. The problem was that she didn't know what she was stepping into. The letter from Robert Aldrin had been kind. She'd read it enough times to have memorized the handwriting, the slight leftward tilt on every capital letter, the way he'd signed his name with a small, careful flourish that she'd told herself meant gentleness. "I am a man of modest means but honest intention," he'd written. "I have a property outside Granger, a small house, and enough work to keep a family fed. I am not a poet, but I will be faithful, and I will try to be good to you and your boy." That was what she'd said yes to. Not romance, not a fairy story. Just the word faithful, written by a stranger in Montana who at least had the decency to acknowledge that her son existed. She'd sold everything she owned in Boston to buy the train ticket, her mother's brooch, the writing desk, the set of copper pots her father had brought from England before she was born, $2.30 left over, tucked inside her left shoe, because she didn't entirely trust herself not to spend it on something foolish in a moment of panic. She hadn't eaten properly since Kansas City. The baby had eaten. She'd made sure of that, but she'd stretched her own portions thin because the dining car cost money she didn't have, and pride was the only thing she had in surplus. Now she was in Montana, and it was raining hard enough to drown the sound of the conductor calling the final stop, and she made herself stand up. The platform was nearly empty when she stepped off the train. A handful of men moving crates, an older woman being helped into a covered buggy by a man with a gray beard, a dog asleep against the far wall, one ear twitching, no Robert Aldrin. She scanned the platform twice. Then she walked its full length, which took 40 seconds, her suitcase in one hand and her baby held close with the other arm, rain hitting the brim of her hat hard enough to sound like someone drumming fingers on a tabletop. She asked the station master if anyone had left a message for Evelyn Carter. He checked the board, checked it again, then handed her a single folded paper without meeting her eyes. She unfolded it with one hand, holding it at an angle to keep the rain off the ink. "Miss Carter, I find I cannot go through with this arrangement. I am sorry for the inconvenience. I wish you well." That was the whole letter, 23 words. No explanation, no forwarding address, no mention of the baby she'd told him about in her second letter, the one he'd responded to warmly, saying it was no matter at all. She stood there and read it twice. Then she folded it back up and put it in her coat pocket, because she didn't know what else to do with it, and standing in the rain holding an abandonment letter felt worse than putting it somewhere she couldn't see it. The baby made a small sound against her chest. Not crying, just a soft questioning noise, the kind he made when he sensed something was wrong but hadn't decided yet whether to be worried about it. "I know," she said quietly. "I know." She went back inside the station and sat down on the bench nearest the stove, because her baby was damp and she needed him warm. The station master watched her from his window but said nothing. A young couple came in out of the rain, laughed about something, and left through the far door. Two men in work clothes talked loudly about a fence line dispute on the other side of the room and paid her no attention at all. She had $2.30, no connections in Montana, no return ticket, no plan. She was 24 years old, and she had exactly as much future in front of her as she was willing to build with her own hands, which at this particular moment, sitting on a wooden bench in a Montana train station with a wet coat and an empty stomach, did not feel like very much at all. She was not a woman who cried easily. Her mother had taught her early that crying in front of strangers was something you did only when you had no other choice, and even then, you made it quick. But the rain was loud enough that she let herself have 30 seconds of it, her face turned toward the window so no one could see, her shoulders perfectly still so her son wouldn't feel them shake. 30 seconds. Then she straightened up and started thinking. She could ask at the general store whether anyone needed domestic help. She could try the hotel to see whether they had work in the kitchen. She was educated, better than most women who'd come west, and she could keep records, write letters, manage accounts. She'd done it for 3 years at a dry goods company in Boston, before the owner's wife decided she didn't like the way her husband looked at the ledger books when Evelyn was the one explaining the numbers. She could figure this out. She had to figure this out. The alternative was wiring her cousin in Philadelphia and admitting that the plan had collapsed before it started, and her cousin had told her clearly enough that taking a baby across the country to marry a stranger was the worst decision she'd ever heard of. So that conversation was not one Evelyn was willing to have. She was making a mental list of her options, tallying them up the way she'd been taught to tally a column of figures, methodical, one after another, when the station door opened and a man walked in shaking rain off his hat. He was not young, late 30s, maybe 40, with the kind of face that had been weathered by outdoor work into something hard-edged but not unkind. Broad through the shoulders, a long coat that had seen considerable use. He moved the way men moved when they were used to having space around them and not particularly interested in taking up less of it than they needed. He stopped at the station master's window, said something, got a package, and turned to go. Then he stopped. He'd seen her. Not the way the other people in the station had seen her, glancing over and looking away because a woman sitting alone with a baby wasn't their problem. He actually looked at her, at the wet coat still steaming near the stove, at the suitcase that had never been opened, at her face, which she'd made carefully neutral but which she suspected was still giving away more than she wanted. He stood there for a moment like he was deciding something. Then he walked over. "Ma'am." He stopped a respectful distance away, hat in his hand. "You waiting on someone?" She considered several answers. The honest one came out before she could stop it. Not anymore. He looked at the suitcase again, at the baby, who had twisted to look up at the stranger with wide, unblinking eyes. "You got somewhere to be tonight?" "I'm working on it." He nodded slowly. Not the nod of a man who found the answer satisfying, but the nod of a man who knew when someone was trying to save face and wasn't going to push on it. "My name's Cole Whitaker," he said. "I've got a ranch about 4 miles north. You're welcome to come out, get dry, have a hot meal, and figure out your next steps somewhere warmer than this." She looked at him directly. "Why?" The question caught him slightly off guard. She could see it in the brief pause before he answered. "Because it's raining," he said, "and you've got a baby." "That's not a reason to trust a stranger." "No," he agreed, "it's not. But I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to get out of the rain while you think." She held his gaze for a moment longer. He didn't look away. He didn't try to fill the silence. He just stood there with his hat in his hand and his expression steady, which was not the expression of a man trying to manipulate her. It was the expression of a man who'd said what he meant and was comfortable waiting to see what she did with it. Her son made another soft sound and pressed his small, cold fist against the side of her neck. "I'm not a charity case," she said. "Didn't say you were. I'll need to earn my keep." "We can talk about that." She picked up her suitcase and stood up. "My name is Evelyn Carter. That's my son, James." Cole nodded once. "Nice to meet you both." She followed him out into the rain, and the station master watched them go, and the dog against the wall opened one eye and then closed it again, and none of them had any idea what had just started. The ride to the Whitaker Ranch took 40 minutes in a wagon that needed new boards on the left side and made Cole visibly irritated every time it hit a rut in the road. He didn't say much. She didn't either. The rain had eased slightly but not stopped, and James had fallen asleep against her shoulder with the deep unconscious trust of a baby who didn't yet understand that sleep was a vulnerability. She watched the land, open and enormous and very dark. Nothing like Boston, where everything was stacked close enough together that you could hear your neighbors through the walls. Here the dark was different, not threatening exactly, but indifferent, the way very large things are indifferent to very small ones. "How long has it been operating?" she asked eventually, because silence that long with a stranger felt like a test she hadn't agreed to take. 22 years, Cole said. "My father built it. I've been running it for 7. "Profitably?" He glanced sideways at her. "That's a direct question. I spent 3 years managing accounts for a business in Boston. I think in terms of numbers. I'm sorry if it's blunt." "It's fine," he said after a moment. "Mostly profitable. Last 2 years have been harder." "Why?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "Neighboring rancher named Holloway. He wants our water rights and about 300 acres on the northern edge. He's been making things difficult." She filed that away. It was not her problem. She was going to be at this ranch for 2 or 3 days at the outside, just long enough to make a plan, and then she was going to find work in Granger and start over. She wasn't going to get involved in someone else's land dispute. She told herself that clearly and specifically, with the same voice she used to balance accounts. When they reached the ranch, she understood immediately why someone would want it. Even in the dark and rain, she could see the shape of it, the main house solid and square, the outbuildings well placed, the fence lines running true and straight. Someone had built this carefully. Someone had loved it. A man came out of the barn at the sound of the wagon and stopped when he saw her. "This is Harlan," Cole said. "He runs the working side of things." Then to Harlan, "Mrs. Carter and her son will be staying a few days. She'll need the guest room." Harlan had a face made entirely of angles and a way of looking at people that suggested he was taking inventory. He looked at Evelyn that way now, not unkindly, but not warmly either. She recognized the look. It was the look of someone trying to figure out if she was going to be trouble. She met his gaze without flinching and let him take his time. "Room's got a leaky window," he told Cole. "Fix it in the morning," Cole said, and climbed down from the wagon. Inside the house was warmer than she'd expected, with a low fire in the main room and a kitchen that smelled like coffee and old wood. A woman came out of the back, Mrs. Draper, Cole's housekeeper, 60s, with a practical face and absolutely no interest in Evelyn's story beyond the basics. "Baby hungry?" "He ate about 2 hours ago. He should be fine until morning." "You?" Evelyn opened her mouth to say she was fine, and her stomach made a sound that answered more honestly. Mrs. Draper went back to the kitchen without a word and came back 8 minutes later with a plate of cold beef, bread, and a cup of coffee that was strong enough to stand a spoon in. She set it on the table in front of Evelyn and left again. Cole had disappeared somewhere in the house. Evelyn sat at the table and ate alone, with James asleep on a folded blanket on the bench beside her, and she was aware of a deep, complicated feeling working its way through her, something that was not gratitude exactly, and not relief, but some third thing she didn't have a name for. The feeling of being somewhere that wasn't hostile. After the last 72 hours, that alone felt like something almost too good to be real. She told herself not to get comfortable. She told herself this twice. The next morning started at 5 with the sound of boots on hardwood floors and horses and men's voices outside, and Evelyn was already awake because she'd been awake most of the night, thinking. She'd made a list in her head. 3 options. First, ask in town for domestic work or clerical work. She was good at records, better at numbers, and she wrote quickly and clearly. Second, wire her cousin, but only if the first option produced nothing within a week. Third, consider whether there was any arrangement possible at this ranch, given that Cole had mentioned 2 difficult years and she had noticed, even in the dark, that the records in the office she'd passed, the door open, the desk visible from the hall, were a disaster. Paper everywhere, ledgers stacked without system, an accountant's nightmare. She was not going to assume she was welcome to stay. She was not going to rely on a stranger's generosity past what was reasonable. But she was also not going to be so proud that she walked away from an actual opportunity if one was sitting in front of her. Cole was in the kitchen when she came down, which surprised her. She'd expected him to already be outside. He was standing at the stove, looking at the coffee pot, with the focused expression of a man who hadn't slept particularly well either. "Morning," he said. "Good morning." She settled James in the chair with the high sides. She'd found it against the kitchen wall the night before and checked it carefully for splinters, and went to help herself to coffee. "May I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "The records in your office, who manages them?" He turned and looked at her. "I do." "When's the last time they were organized?" A pause. "That's a specific question. I saw them through the open door last night. I wasn't trying to be nosy. I noticed things." Cole set down his coffee and leaned against the counter. He had an expression she was starting to recognize, not guarded exactly, but careful, like a man who'd been surprised too many times to take anything at face value. "My father kept the records. When he died, I took over, but I'm better with the land than the numbers." "I can see that," she said, and then immediately regretted how it sounded. "I mean, the land obviously runs well. The operation looks solid from what I saw. But the financial side is a mess," he said, without apparent embarrassment. "I know." "I can help with that," she said. "If you want, while I'm here, in exchange for room and board for myself and James, until I can make other arrangements. That's not charity. That's a trade." He looked at her for a long moment. James blew a small bubble and grabbed the edge of the table with both fists and looked extremely pleased with himself. "You ever managed ranch accounts?" Cole asked. "No, but accounts are accounts. The categories are different. The principles aren't." Another long look. Then, "Harlan won't like it." "I'm not asking Harlan." Something shifted in Cole's expression. Not quite a smile, more like the possibility of one. "All right," he said. "Show me what you can do." She spent 3 days inside the mess of that office, and they were 3 of the most satisfying days she'd had in 2 years. The records went back 6 years in some places, 4 in others, and 3 in the places where Cole had apparently given up entirely and started writing numbers on loose paper he'd tucked into books. She made stacks. She made categories. She found 2 contracts that appeared to overlap in ways that shouldn't have been possible, and a payment schedule that Cole had been following that was costing him $40 a year more than his original agreement required. "Where did this come from?" she asked, when she showed it to him on the second evening. He looked at the paper for a moment. "Supplies contract. Signed it 2 years ago." "The original rate was here," she pointed, "but someone added a line here about a quarterly adjustment for transport costs. Was that in the original?" He was quiet. "Cole." "No," he said. "It wasn't." "Who handles your supply contracts?" "Grant Holloway's cousin," he said slowly, "runs the general store." She let that sit in the air between them. "This is fraud," she said. "Small fraud, but fraud. You've been paying for something you didn't agree to." Cole sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at her. "You found that in 3 days. I would have found it in 1 day if you hadn't written half of it in pencil. I thought a pencil meant I could change it if I was wrong. That's not how records work." He was quiet again. And then, in a voice that was different from his usual one, quieter, something more careful in it, he said, "I'm glad you're here." She looked up from the ledger. He looked immediately like he regretted saying it, or at least regretted the way he'd said it, and he stood up and found something to look at near the window. She went back to the ledger, but she sat with the words for a moment before she did. They were just words. They didn't mean anything complicated. But they were the first time in longer than she could immediately calculate that someone had said they were glad she specifically was somewhere. It was harder to shake than she expected. On the 4th day, Harlan came to find her. She was in the barn because James had developed a fascination with the sound the horses made, and she'd discovered that 10 minutes of watching the horses was worth about 40 minutes of settled content baby afterward, which was a trade she would make every single time. Harlan stopped at the barn door and looked at her the way he always did, that careful, taking stock look. But something in it was different today, less calculating, more direct. "Cole tell you about Holloway?" he asked. "Somewhat." "He's going to push harder," Harlan said. "He always does, come the end of summer. Wants the water rights before the dry season hits and the price goes up. Last year he cut 3 of our fence lines and blamed it on weather." "You think he'll try something like that again?" "I think he'll try something worse," Harlan said, and the steadiness in his voice was not comforting. "And I think Cole's going to try to handle it the way he always does, which is alone, because he doesn't trust anyone enough to ask for help. She looked at him. Why are you telling me this? Harlan considered that for a moment. Because you found that supply contract thing in 3 days, he said, and because you're still here. He left before she could respond, which was probably for the best, because she wasn't sure what she would have said. She stood in the barn with her son in her arms and the smell of hay and horses around her, and she thought about Robert Aldrin and his 23-word letter, and she thought about the train station and the rain, and she thought about the way Cole had looked when she told him the supply contract was fraud. She thought about what Harlan had said. You're still here. She had not planned on being still here. She had planned on leaving by the end of the week. She told herself that clearly, with the same firm voice she used for everything. But the records weren't done. There were still 3 years of incomplete entries and what looked like a pattern in the missing payments that she hadn't fully mapped yet. And James had slept through the night twice in a row, which hadn't happened in 2 months. And she was not entirely sure if that was the mountain air or the fact that for the first time in a long time, she herself was sleeping without bracing for what the next day would bring. She was not comfortable. Not exactly. But she was something that rhymed with it, which, she knew, was the most dangerous thing of all. She held her son a little tighter and went back to the house. The records weren't finished. She wasn't leaving until they were. That was all it was. She told herself that clearly and specifically, and almost believed it. She found the second discrepancy on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after she'd told herself she was leaving by the end of the first week. It was buried in a land survey document from 4 years prior. Not the kind of thing you'd notice if you were just glancing, and not the kind of thing Cole would have had any reason to question, because Cole trusted the survey the way you trust a doctor's signature on a form. You assumed the man who wrote it knew what he was doing. But Evelyn had spent an afternoon the week before cross-referencing the survey measurements against the water rights agreement, and the numbers didn't line up. Not by much, 40 feet on the eastern boundary, maybe 60 on the north. But 40 feet was enough. 40 feet placed correctly meant the seasonal creek that fed the Whitaker North pastures sat right on the edge of what could be argued either way, and anyone who wanted to make that argument had exactly the paperwork to do it. She sat back in her chair and stared at the ceiling for a moment. Then she went to find Cole. He was behind the barn with Harlan and 2 other ranch hands, arguing about a section of fence that had gone down in the wind 2 nights ago. Not arguing the way people argue when they're angry, arguing the way working men argue when they disagree on method, and both of them think they're right, which is a different thing entirely and considerably louder. She waited until there was a gap in the discussion and said, "Cole, I need to show you something." He looked at her, then at Harlan, then back at her, and something in her face must have communicated that this was not a small something, because he handed Harlan the fence post he'd been holding and followed her without another word. In the office, she spread the 2 documents side by side and walked him through it. She kept her voice even and her explanation precise. She'd learned in Boston that the fastest way to lose a man's attention was to let him hear emotion before he understood the facts. Emotion came after, facts first. Cole leaned over the desk and looked at the documents for a long time without speaking. "The survey was filed by a man named Pruitt," he finally said. "Who hired Pruitt?" A long pause. "Holloway recommended him," Cole said, in a voice that had gone very flat. 2 years before my father died. Said he was the best surveyor in the county." Evelyn nodded once. Cole straightened up. He put his hands on the back of the chair and gripped it, and she watched him do the thing she'd seen him do before when something made him angry. That specific stillness, like a man who's learned that the first impulse is usually the wrong one and has trained himself to wait it out. "He rigged the survey," Cole said. It wasn't a question. "I can't prove that," she said. "Not yet. What I can say is that the boundary as recorded in the survey doesn't match the boundary as described in your original deed, and your original deed is older and should legally take precedence. But someone would have to make that argument formally, and that requires a lawyer. Lawyers cost money." "Yes." "Money I don't currently have because I've been paying a fraudulent supply surcharge for 2 years. "That's a solvable problem," she said. "I've documented the overcharges. You have grounds to recover at least some of that." Cole let go of the chair and walked to the window. Outside, she could hear Harlan and the other men still working on the fence, the sound of hammering carrying sharp and clear in the morning air. "He's been planning this," Cole said, Not to her specifically. Just out loud, the way people say things when they're working through something and need to hear it in the air. Not just the last 2 years, longer. That's what the pattern suggests. He turned back to face her. How long did it take you to find this? 3 weeks. My father had these records for 20 years. Your father wasn't looking for it, she said. Neither were you. You were running a ranch. You were doing the actual work. No one told you to be suspicious of a land survey. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Then he said, "Why are you still here?" It was the same question Harlan had essentially asked her, but from Cole it landed differently. Less like an observation, more like a real question, the kind a person asks when they actually want an answer. She considered several responses. The true answer was complicated, and she wasn't sure she'd fully sorted it herself, so she gave him the simplest version of it. "The records aren't done," she said. He held her gaze. "That's the only reason?" She picked up the land survey and squared the edges against the desk. "I'll need to get these copied before we send anything to a lawyer. Do you know someone in Granger who does that?" He let it go. Which she appreciated. "Millie Pruitt at the postal office," he said. "No relation to the surveyor. She's got a good hand and she's discreet." "Good." She set the papers in the folder she'd made for them. "I'll go tomorrow morning if that's all right. I'll drive you. I can manage on my own." "I know you can," he said. "But Granger's a smaller town than it looks, and people talk. And if you walk into Millie's with those documents alone, someone will notice and someone will mention it, and if that someone happens to know Holloway, he'll know we're looking," she finished. "He'll know we're looking," Cole confirmed. She put the folder in the desk drawer and locked it. She'd found the key the second week, tucked behind a loose board in the top drawer, and what she'd gathered was Cole's idea of a filing system. "Fine," she said. "Tomorrow morning." She turned to leave, and he said, "Evelyn." She stopped. "Thank you," he said. Just that. No elaboration. She nodded once and went to check on James, who was in the kitchen with Mrs. Draper, conducting what appeared to be a very serious investigation into the contents of a flour tin. The trip to Granger the next morning went smoothly until it didn't. They were in and out of the postal office in 20 minutes. Millie Pruitt was efficient and didn't ask questions, which Evelyn noted as a mark in her favor, and were back at the wagon in the main street when a man stepped off the boardwalk in front of them. He was perhaps 50, heavy across the shoulders, with a well-cut coat that cost more than anything else on the street, and the kind of face that spent a lot of time being agreed with. He looked at Cole with the easy authority of a man who had decided long ago that other people moved for him, not the other way around. "Whitaker," he said, pleasantly, the way a cat is pleasant. "Holloway," Cole said. Grant Holloway's eyes moved to Evelyn, slowly, taking his time, the way he took his time with everything. "I don't believe I've had the pleasure." "Evelyn Carter," she said, before Cole could speak. She kept her voice level and her hands still. "I help manage the Whitaker Ranch accounts." Something happened in Holloway's expression, small, fast, gone before most people would catch it. But Evelyn was watching for it, and she caught it. Surprise first, then something that recalculated very quickly. "Is that so?" he said. "It is." He looked at Cole. "Couldn't manage your own books?" "Found I didn't need to," Cole said. Holloway smiled. It was the kind of smile that had nothing warm in it. "Well, always good to see progress." He looked at Evelyn one more time, not the way men look at women, but the way a man looks at an obstacle he's trying to measure. "Miss Carter, welcome to Granger." He walked on. They watched him go. When he was out of earshot, Evelyn said quietly, "He knew who I was." "I know," Cole said. "Before I told him my name. I know." She looked at Cole. "He had someone watching the ranch." Cole's jaw was tight. "Probably Harlan's replacement hand, the one we hired 6 weeks ago. I had a feeling about him and didn't act on it fast enough." They climbed into the wagon. She held the folder with the copied documents against her chest, inside her coat. The originals were locked in the desk at the ranch. The copies were going into a separate, safer place she hadn't yet decided on. "He's going to move faster now," she said. "Yes." "Whatever he was planning, he'll accelerate it." "Yes." She looked straight ahead as Cole turned the horses toward the road home. "Then we need to be ready before he does." Cole didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice had something in it she hadn't heard before. Not defeat, not quite, but the thing that lives close to defeat without crossing into it. "I've been fighting Holloway for 2 years," he said. "I know how to dig in, but he's got money and connections, and I've got evidence," she said. He glanced at her. "You have evidence," she said again, firmer. "And that's something he didn't account for because he didn't account for me, which is his mistake, not yours." Cole was quiet for a moment, then very quietly, "You're not what I expected when I walked into that train station." "What did you expect?" "Someone I'd have to take care of." She looked at him sideways. "And instead?" He kept his eyes on the road. "Someone who keeps finding things I didn't know I was missing." She didn't answer that. There was nothing to say to it that wouldn't open a door she wasn't ready to walk through, so she kept quiet and watched the road and felt the folder against her ribs and thought about what came next. The replacement hand, a young man named Declan who had arrived with good references and an easy smile, was gone from the ranch by the following morning. Cole had sent him off the night before with 2 weeks' wages and no explanation, which was apparently a language Declan understood well enough, because he packed his things without argument and was gone before sunrise. Harlan had figured it out before Cole told him. Harlan had the specific instinct of a man who'd watched people come and go on working land for 30 years, and knew the difference between a hand who was there for the work and a hand who was there for something else. "Should have caught it sooner," Harlan said when Cole told him. "I should have caught it sooner," Cole said. "You were distracted." Harlan's tone was entirely neutral, which was its own kind of editorial. Cole let it pass. "Double-check who has access to the equipment barn. I want to know exactly what he could have seen or passed along." Harlan nodded and went to do it, and Evelyn, who had been standing in the kitchen doorway and heard the whole exchange, went back to the desk and added another item to her list. The list had gotten long. On one side, what Holloway had done, the fraudulent survey, the supply contract overcharge, the planted hand, the fence lines the previous year, written off as weather. She was building a picture, and the picture was of a man who had been systematically dismantling Cole Whitaker's operation piece by piece, slowly enough that no single action looked like an attack, only like a streak of bad luck. On the other side, what they had: the original deed, the documented overcharges, the survey discrepancy. A pattern, if they could present it clearly enough that a judge would look at it as a pattern rather than coincidence. She needed one more thing, one more piece that connected the survey to Holloway directly, not just circumstantially. The recommendation alone wasn't enough. She needed something that showed Holloway had directed Pruitt, not just suggested him. She wasn't sure that piece existed. She spent 3 evenings looking for it in every document she hadn't yet fully examined, and she found a lot of things, including 2 more supply irregularities she hadn't noticed before, and a letter Cole's father had written but apparently never sent, addressed to the county surveying office, asking about the process for contesting a boundary, but not the thing she was actually looking for. On the 4th evening, she found something else instead. It was in the back of a ledger from 6 years ago, a ledger she'd nearly skipped because it mostly covered feed purchases and equipment maintenance, nothing that had seemed legally significant. But tucked inside the back cover was an envelope, unsealed, with no address on the outside. Inside the envelope was a bill of sale for a 10-acre strip of land along the eastern boundary. The sale was dated 3 years before the survey. The seller was a man named Thomas Keller. The buyer, recorded in careful handwriting that was not Cole's and not his father's, was Grant Holloway. The strip of land was 12 feet wide and ran north to south along exactly the boundary the survey had misrepresented. She sat very still for a moment. If Holloway had already purchased that strip, if the strip existed legally as his property before the survey was conducted, then the survey hadn't just been wrong. It had been designed to formalize a boundary that matched a piece of land Holloway had bought quietly, years in advance, before anyone was looking. He hadn't just falsified a survey. He'd laid the groundwork years before he needed it. She brought it to Cole that night after dinner when the house was quiet and Mrs. Draper had gone home and James was asleep upstairs. She spread everything on the kitchen table, the bill of sale, the survey, the deed, the supply contracts, and walked him through the full picture. Cole sat at the table and looked at it for a long time without speaking. When he finally looked up, something had shifted in his face. Not just anger. She'd seen him angry. This was different, heavier. My father, he said slowly, spent the last 2 years of his life thinking the ranch was failing because he'd managed it badly. He told me that. He said he was sorry. She waited. He died thinking he'd let it go, Cole said. Thinking he'd let my mother's work and his own work just fall apart because of weather and bad luck and his own decisions. She couldn't say anything to fix that. There was nothing to say to fix that. It wasn't him, she said quietly. No, Cole said. It wasn't him. He put his hand flat on the table, on top of the bill of sale, and pressed down like he was keeping it from moving. His jaw was working on something he wasn't saying out loud. Cole, she said. He looked at her. I'm going to get you everything you need to take this to court, she said. Every document, every discrepancy, every connection. I'm going to build it clean enough that there's no way a judge misses it. That's what I can do. Why? He said. Why are you doing this? She opened her mouth and then closed it, because the first answer that came up was the honest one, and it surprised her. Because your father didn't fail, she said, and someone should say so where it counts. Cole looked at her for a long time, the kind of looking that has weight behind it, that isn't just seeing but working something out. I'll wire the lawyer and Helena tomorrow, he said finally. Good. He'll want to meet. I'll be ready. Cole nodded and began stacking the documents carefully, the way she'd shown him. Edges aligned, no loose corners. He was learning. She went upstairs to check on James and found him exactly as she'd left him, on his back, one arm thrown out sideways, completely abandoned to sleep the way only very small children can be. She stood in the doorway and watched him for a moment. Somewhere behind her in this house was a man who had just learned that his father's legacy had been stolen from him by someone who counted on no one ever looking closely enough. And somewhere in Granger, Grant Holloway was almost certainly sitting in his comfortable house with his comfortable certainty that he had covered everything, and this particular story was going in the direction he'd planned. Evelyn went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to the sound of the ranch settling around her, the creak of the house, the distant sound of horses, the wind off the mountain, and she thought about Robert Aldrin and his 23 words, and she thought about the train station and standing in the rain with $2 in her shoe and a baby who needed her to be steadier than she felt. She had not gone west to become someone who fought land fraud cases in a Montana kitchen. She hadn't gone west to become the person who rebuilt a stranger's financial records, or exposed a decades-long scheme, or stayed long past the week she'd promised herself. But here she was. And the thing was, and this was the part she hadn't told anyone, not even herself, not fully. The thing was that she wasn't afraid. She had been afraid every single day in Boston, every day of the passage west, every minute in that train station. The fear had been constant and exhausting, and she'd carried it the way you carry something too heavy, bent slightly under it all the time. She wasn't bent now. She wasn't sure what had changed. Maybe the records. Maybe the clean, solvable nature of a problem you could lay out on a table and look at directly. Maybe James sleeping through the night. Maybe Cole saying, "I'm glad you're here," and then looking immediately embarrassed about it. Maybe all of it. She turned onto her side and closed her eyes. The lawyer from Helena arrived 8 days later, on a Tuesday, and his name was Everett Marsh. He was 60, methodical, and had the specific energy of a man who'd spent 40 years watching people underestimate paperwork and had a lot of opinions about it. He spent 4 hours with the documents. Evelyn walked him through the whole picture, piece by piece, with Cole sitting across the table and Harlan leaning in the doorway because no one had told him to leave and he hadn't offered to. Marsh asked good questions, sharp ones. The kind that found the weak points in an argument, and there were weak points. There were always weak points. But by the end of the 4 hours, he sat back in his chair and looked at Evelyn with the expression of a man recalibrating. "How did you find all this?" he asked. "I organized the records," she said. "You're not a lawyer." "No." "You're not a surveyor." "No." "What are you?" She considered that. "I'm someone who doesn't like it when the numbers don't add up." Marsh looked at Cole. "Where'd you find her?" "Train station," Cole said. Marsh looked back at Evelyn. "We have a strong case," he said. "Not airtight. The bill of sale from Keller needs verification, and we'll need to establish Pruitt's connection to Holloway beyond recommendation, but strong. If we file in district court, I'd give us better than even odds." What do we need to strengthen it? Evelyn asked. Pruitt, Marsh said. Talk to the surveyor himself. He may not even know the extent of what he's involved in. Small county surveyors don't always understand that moving a line 40 feet is the same as theft if it's done on purpose. If he's willing to talk, it could close the gap. Holloway will have him warned off, Cole said. Possibly, but Pruitt's a local man with a local reputation. If Holloway goes down, and he may regardless, Pruitt goes with him unless he's cooperated. That's leverage. Evelyn looked at Cole. Cole looked at her. I'll go, she said. Both men looked at her. Pruitt doesn't know me, she said. He knows Cole. If Cole walks up to his door, Pruitt's afraid. If I do, he doesn't know what to make of me, and that's useful. It's not safe, Cole said. Holloway doesn't know what I have yet, she said. He knows I've been organizing records. He doesn't know I found the bill of sale. Going to talk to Pruitt before he figures that out is the smart move. Harlan made a sound from the doorway that might have been agreement. Cole was very still for a moment. Not the angry stillness, the other kind. The kind where he was thinking fast and didn't like where the thinking was going. I'm not asking your permission, she said gently. I know, he said. And then, take Harlan's horse. It's faster than the wagon. She nodded. Marsh gathered his papers and looked at Evelyn one more time. If you can get Pruitt's statement, this case becomes considerably less complicated. I'll do what I can, she said. What she didn't say, what she kept to herself, tucked in the same place she kept the feeling she didn't have a name for, was that she'd already written out exactly what she intended to say to Pruitt. She'd written 3 versions of the conversation, anticipated 3 different ways it could go, and prepared for all of them. She hadn't been this prepared for something since the morning she packed her suitcase in Boston and told herself she was ready for what came next. She'd been wrong then. She wasn't sure she was wrong now. Pruitt lived 6 miles east of the ranch, on a small property that didn't have much going for it except a decent well and a clear view of the mountain to the north. He was standing outside when she rode up, a thin man, past 60, with the squinting look of someone who spent a lot of time outside measuring things against the horizon. He watched her ride up with the cautious attention of someone who wasn't expecting visitors and wasn't sure if that was good or bad. She stopped the horse and looked at him calmly. Mr. Pruitt, my name is Evelyn Carter. I work for Cole Whitaker. I'd like to talk to you about a land survey you conducted 4 years ago. He said nothing for a moment. His face did something careful and controlled, and she recognized the expression. It was the same thing people did when they were deciding how much they already knew that she knew. I've done a lot of surveys, he said. This one was on the eastern boundary of the Whitaker property, she said. I've got the original filed document with your signature. I also have the original deed, which doesn't match it. She paused. I'm not here to accuse you of anything, Mr. Pruitt. I'm here because I think someone may have given you information that wasn't accurate, and you may not have known that. She watched the decision move through him. He was old enough to be tired, and tired people, in her experience, didn't usually choose the complicated path when someone offered them the simple one. He looked at the mountain for a moment. You'd better come inside, he said. She tied the horse to the post and followed him in, and outside the wind was picking up off the mountain in the way it did late in the day, carrying the smell of coming weather. And somewhere to the west, without any of them knowing it yet, Grant Holloway was sitting in his office reading a note from someone who'd been at the Whitaker Ranch that morning, and learning for the first time that things were considerably further along than he'd believed. His face, when he read it, went very still. And then he picked up his hat and told his man to get the horses ready. Pruitt's house smelled like pipe tobacco and old paper, which was not surprising for a man who spent half his life outdoors and the other half recording what he'd found there. He had a small desk in the corner of the main room buried under rolled documents and loose charts, and the walls had tack marks where maps had been pinned and removed so many times the plaster had given up trying to look clean. He didn't offer her coffee. He sat across from her at the kitchen table with his hands folded in front of him and looked at her the way a man looks at something he's been half expecting and half dreading for a long time. She put the copied survey on the table between them. Then the deed. Then the bill of sale for the Keller strip. He looked at them without touching them. You found the Keller parcel, he said. Yes. He was quiet. His hands, still folded, tightened slightly. Who else has seen this? My employer's lawyer from Helena, she said, and Cole Whitaker. Pruitt closed his eyes for a moment. Just a moment. Then he opened them and looked out the window at the mountain, which was the direction people looked in this part of Montana when they needed to think about something hard. He told me the Keller strip was legitimately purchased, Pruitt said. Holloway. He showed me this bill of sale himself, said it was all properly registered, and that the survey just needed to reflect the actual legal boundary. Did you verify the registration? She asked. A long pause. No, he said. I should have. I know I should have. But Holloway he was a man you didn't question in this county. Not then. Not without a reason that would hold up. He looked down at his hands. I had 2 daughters and a wife, and the survey business was the only income I had. She understood that. She understood it more than she wanted to, because it was the same math she'd done herself 100 times. The math of what you do when the safe choice and the right choice are not the same thing, and you have people depending on you. The Keller parcel, she said, wasn't registered at the county office. I checked before I came here. Pruitt looked up. It may have been registered somewhere, she said, but not with the county, which means the sale either didn't happen the way Holloway presented it, or it happened in a way that was never meant to hold up to scrutiny. He sat with that. If you knew, she said carefully, that the boundary you recorded was wrong. I suspected, he said. I want to be honest with you about that. I suspected. But suspecting and knowing aren't the same thing, and I let myself stay in the suspecting part because it was easier. He met her eyes. That's not a defense. I understand that. It's not, she agreed, but it's also not what I need from you right now. She folded her hands on the table, mirroring him without meaning to. Mr. Pruitt, if you were willing to give a written statement to our lawyer, describing exactly what Holloway told you, what he showed you, and what you were asked to record, that statement would be worth a great deal in court. He stared at the table. Holloway will know within a week. He's got people everywhere. He'll find out regardless. The question is whether you're on the right side when he does. Pruitt looked at the bill of sale, the survey, the deed. He was reading them properly now, not just looking at them, and she watched the understanding move through his face, the full shape of it, what it meant, what had actually happened. His father, Pruitt said slowly. Cole's father. Died thinking. Yes, she said. He did. Pruitt stood up from the table. He walked to the window and stood there for almost a full minute, and she let him, because there was nothing she could say that would make this easier, and she knew it. When he turned back, his face had settled into something. Not peace exactly. The thing you settle into when you've decided to do something hard, and you've stopped arguing with yourself about it. Give me until tomorrow morning, he said. I'll write the statement tonight. I'll bring it to your ranch myself. That's not necessary. I know it's not necessary, he said. I'll do it anyway. She gathered the documents and stood up. At the door, she paused. Mr. Pruitt, whatever Holloway told you, whatever he made it sound like, what happened to the Whitaker family happened to them over years, slowly. That wasn't an accident. That was a plan. He looked at her. His eyes were tired and direct. I know, he said. I've known for a while. She nodded once and went out to the horse. The wind off the mountain had gotten colder, and the sky in the west had gone a deep, complicated orange that would have been beautiful under other circumstances. She rode back toward the ranch and tried to sort through everything she was carrying, the statement, the plan, the question of what Holloway would do when he realized how far things had gotten. She was most of the way back when she heard the horse behind her. She didn't look immediately. On the open road, another rider wasn't unusual, but the pace was wrong, too fast, too deliberate, closing the distance with a purpose that didn't feel like someone headed the same direction for innocent reasons. She nudged Harlan's horse into a canter. The horse behind her did the same. She didn't run. Running would confirm she was frightened and give the other rider a frame for what this was. Instead, she kept her pace steady and her spine straight and her eyes on the ranch gate, which she could see now, maybe a quarter-mile ahead. And she thought very clearly and without panic, if he's going to do something, it will be before the gate. The sound of hooves got louder. She glanced back once. One rider, a man she didn't recognize, in a dark coat, coming fast. The gate was 200 yards. She gave Harlan's horse its head and let it run. They went through the gate at full gallop, and she pulled up in the yard just as Harlan came out of the barn at the sound. The rider behind her had pulled up at the gate. He hadn't come through, which told her he wasn't stupid enough to come onto Whitaker land openly. He sat there for a moment. Then he turned his horse and rode away. Harlan was at her side before she'd properly gotten her breath back. What happened? Someone followed me from Pruitt's. She handed him the reins. Her hands were not shaking. She was slightly surprised by that. He didn't come through the gate. You get a look at him? Medium build, dark coat, gray horse, she thought. He had a Holloway brand on his saddle. I saw it when I looked back. Harlan's expression did something hard and controlled. I'll tell Cole. Tell him Pruitt's bringing a statement tomorrow morning, she said, and tell him Holloway already knows we've been talking. She went inside and found James in the kitchen with Mrs. Draper, who was letting him bang a wooden spoon against a pot with the focused enthusiasm of a baby who has discovered percussion. He looked up when Evelyn came in and held out the spoon with an expression of enormous generosity. She sat down on the kitchen floor next to him, which was undignified and she didn't care, and held him for a moment while Mrs. Draper pretended to be very busy with something on the stove. Her heart rate came back down. She put James back on the floor with his spoon and went to find Cole. Cole was already moving when she found him. He'd heard from Harlan before she reached him, and he had that specific stillness again. The one that wasn't calm but looked like it. The one that meant he was thinking faster than he was letting show. You rode back through that alone, he said. Yes. After you'd just visited the one man Holloway most wants to keep quiet. I didn't know he'd have someone watching Pruitt's place, she said, though I should have considered it. I should have gone with you. You would have made it worse. If a Whitaker hand is seen riding to Pruitt's, Holloway knows exactly what it means. Me riding there alone, he had to figure out who I was first. Cole ran a hand over the back of his neck. He knows now. He suspected before. Now he knows. She sat down at the desk. Which means we need to move faster. Pruitt's bringing his statement tomorrow morning. As soon as we have it, Marsh needs to file. Holloway's going to do something before that, Cole said. That's not me being paranoid. That's how he operates. He's going to find a way to disrupt, delay, or destroy whatever we're building. What does he usually do? Cole was quiet for a moment. Last time he wanted to push hard, he hit the north fence line at night, cut the wire, scattered about 60 head into the hills. Took us 3 days to round them up, and by then the dispute we were supposed to resolve that week had been postponed. He creates problems that pull you away from the thing he actually wants to stop. Every time. She thought about that. Then we don't let him separate us from the evidence. What does that mean practically? It means the documents stay locked. It means we make copies and keep them in 2 places. It means whoever is watching the north fence tonight is someone you absolutely trust. She looked at him. And it means that if he creates a problem, one of us handles it while the other stays with the paperwork. We don't both go. Cole was looking at her with that expression again, the one that had weight behind it. You think like a general, he said. I think like someone who's been outmaneuvered before and would prefer not to repeat the experience. She opened the desk drawer and checked the lock on the document folder. Tight. Good. Which of your hands do you trust without any reservation? Harlan. And Eddie Marsh, not the lawyer, different person. He's been here 12 years. Put them on the north fence tonight, both of them. That leaves the south side short. Holloway doesn't want the south side. He wants the water rights, and the water rights argument runs through the North Boundary Survey. That's where he'll push. Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded and went to find Harlan. She sat alone in the office and spread the documents on the desk one more time and went through them with fresh eyes, the way she did when she was worried she'd missed something. A pattern she'd stopped seeing because she'd looked at it too many times. An assumption she'd made too early. She found one. It was small, and it might have been nothing, but it was there. In the supply contract irregularities she'd documented, the timing was wrong. The overcharges had started not 2 years ago, as she'd told Cole, but closer to 3. She'd miscounted because 2 of the quarterly records were misfiled, and she'd assumed they belonged to the prior year. 3 years. That put it right around the same time as the land survey. She sat very still. If the supply overcharges and the survey had started in the same quarter, if Holloway had moved on both fronts simultaneously, then this wasn't just a land grab with a fraudulent survey as cover. This was a coordinated financial squeeze. Bleed the ranch from the supply side, lock down the boundary from the legal side, and wait for Cole to get desperate enough to sell. It was patient. It was methodical. It was exactly the kind of thing that took years to see because you had to be standing in the right place with all the records in the right order. She wrote it all down, dated, documented, cross-referenced. When she was done, she had 6 additional pages of notes and a clearer picture of what Grant Holloway had actually built than anyone had ever put together in one place. She looked at the clock on the wall. It was almost midnight. She hadn't noticed. She locked the desk, checked the lock twice, and went to bed. She was asleep within 3 minutes, which was not something she'd been able to say for most of her adult life, and she did not think about what that meant until much later. Pruitt arrived at 7 the next morning on a horse that looked like it had been ridden hard the night before. He had a sealed envelope in his coat pocket, and eyes that hadn't slept, and a jaw that was set in a way she recognized, the jaw of someone who'd made a decision and was not going to let themselves reverse it. He handed her the envelope without ceremony. She opened it and read it at the kitchen table while he accepted the coffee Mrs. Draper handed him without being asked, and Cole stood by the window, and Harlan and Eddie were somewhere out on the north fence where they'd been all night and had reported nothing unusual, which was either reassuring or meant Holloway was working on something they hadn't anticipated. The statement was 4 pages, handwritten, detailed, and signed. Pruitt had named the date, the location, the specific representations Holloway had made, the document Holloway had shown him, and the price he'd been paid for the survey, which was, she noted, significantly more than the standard rate, which was its own form of evidence. He'd also included something she hadn't asked for, a note at the end stating that he'd approached the county surveying office 2 years after filing with the intention of flagging the discrepancy and had been told by the office manager, a man named Willis Crane, that the matter was already on record and being reviewed. Pruitt had heard nothing further. She looked up. Willis Crane is still the office manager? Was, last I checked, Pruitt said. He's Holloway's brother-in-law. She wrote that down. Cole was reading over her shoulder now. She heard him exhale slowly. Marsh needs this today, she said. I'll ride to the telegraph office, Cole said. Wire him to come personally, she said. Don't put the details in the wire. Just tell him we have the statement and we need him here as soon as possible. Cole nodded and reached for his hat. Cole. He stopped. Take Eddie with you. Don't ride alone. He looked at her for a moment. Not annoyed, just taking it in. All right, he said, and went. She turned back to Pruitt. This is going to get complicated before it gets simpler. I want you to know that. I know it, he said. He was looking at his coffee. Holloway's not going to sit still. No, but when this reaches court, and it will, this statement is the piece that changes the shape of everything. She folded the pages carefully and returned them to the envelope. You did the right thing. He didn't say anything to that, just nodded once, the way people nod when the right thing has cost them something and they're not yet sure what. He left 20 minutes later, and she went back to the desk. What Holloway sent that afternoon was not men on the north fence. It was a letter, delivered by a boy from town, handed to Mrs. Draper, brought to Evelyn because Cole wasn't back yet, and Harlan couldn't read above a basic level, and the boy said it was addressed to the person managing the Whitaker accounts. It was addressed specifically to Evelyn Carter, her full name, correctly spelled. She opened it at the desk, alone, and read it twice. It was politely worded, which was the most frightening thing about it. It expressed no threats, made no accusations, offered no ultimatums. What it did was inform her, in the careful language of a man who understood exactly what he was doing, that a thorough review of the property records for the Whitaker Ranch had revealed an outstanding debt, a debt to a land company called the Meridian Land and Property Trust, of $4,000, incurred by Cole's father 8 years ago as part of a loan agreement, and that this debt had been recently acquired by Mr. Holloway's business interests and was now due in full within 60 days. $4,000. 60 days. There was no such debt in any record she had found. She read the letter a third time. She was very still at the desk for about 30 seconds. Then she started writing. She wrote quickly, without stopping to choose words carefully, just getting it all down, the structure of what this was and what it meant. A debt that appeared nowhere in the record she'd spent weeks going through, claimed by a land company she'd never heard of, conveniently timed to arrive the same week they'd contacted a lawyer. Either Cole's father had incurred a debt so carefully hidden that it had left absolutely no trace in 6 years of records, which was possible but unlikely, given that his father had been, by all evidence, a methodical man in everything except his filing system, or this document was fabricated. If it was fabricated, it was sophisticated fabrication. A land trust with a real name, real-sounding documentation, delivered through proper channels. The kind of thing that was hard to disprove quickly. The kind of thing designed to panic Cole into a reaction before he had time to think. She locked the letter in the desk with the other documents. When Cole came back 2 hours later with Eddie and the news that Marsh would arrive by Friday, she waited until he'd had 10 minutes and a cup of coffee. Then she showed him the letter. He read it once, sat down, read it again. "I've never heard of the Meridian Land and Property Trust," he said. "I know. There's no record of this loan. I know that too. Could there be something I don't know about?" She had expected this question, and she'd thought carefully about the honest answer. "There's nothing in any document I've reviewed that shows this debt. That doesn't prove it doesn't exist, but it makes it very unlikely. Your father kept everything, even things he probably should have thrown away. If there was a loan of this size, something would show it." Cole set the letter on the table. "He's trying to force a settlement. He's trying to create a second problem for you to solve while the first one is already taking all your attention. If you spend the next 60 days chasing the Meridian Trust, you're not spending it working with Marsh on the survey case. Can we fight both? We can fight both if we don't let either one get ahead of us." She picked up the letter. "I'm going to document exactly what this says and when it arrived. When Marsh gets here, he needs to see it immediately. A fraudulent debt claim is its own separate legal matter, and it connects to the pattern of everything else we've already built." Cole was quiet. He had the look of a man carrying more weight than he wanted anyone to see him carrying, and the weight was not just the ranch. She knew that. It was his father. It was the 2 years of believing the failure was real. It was the specific grief of learning that what broke someone you loved wasn't bad luck or their own shortcomings, but another person's deliberate cruelty. "Cole," she said. He looked at her. "Holloway sent this because he's scared," she said. "Not because he has the advantage. A man who has the advantage doesn't need to do something like this." He looked at the letter for a moment, then at her. "How are you not scared?" She thought about that. About the rider who'd followed her from Pruitt's house. About riding back through the gate at full gallop with her heart loud in her ears. About standing in a rain-soaked train station with $2 in her shoe and a baby who needed her to be steadier than she felt. "I am scared," she said. "I'm scared every day. I'm just also occupied." Something in Cole's expression shifted. The weight didn't leave, but it redistributed somehow, like he'd handed a portion of it somewhere and hadn't realized he'd been waiting for someone to take it. "Occupied," he repeated. "There's always something to do next," she said. "When I'm doing the next thing, I'm not afraid. It's only when I stop." He was quiet for a moment. "What's the next thing?" She picked up her pen. "I write up the Meridian Trust letter and add it to the case file. You wire Harlan to check the north fence again. Different time, different route, don't let it be predictable. And tomorrow morning, you and I go through every single financial document we haven't yet looked at, because if Holloway has manufactured one debt, he may have tried this before." Cole stood up and reached for his hat. "Evelyn," he said. She looked up. I'm aware you didn't sign on for any of this when you came west." He stopped, as if the sentence had more to it, but he wasn't sure whether to say it. "Whatever happens with the case, whatever happens with Marsh or Holloway or the ranch, I want you to know that what you've done here, what you've found, my father deserved to have someone find it." She held his gaze. "Yes," she said. He did. Cole nodded once and went to find Harlan. She went back to writing. Friday came with gray skies and a hard wind, and Everett Marsh arriving on the noon stage looking like a man who'd slept in a moving coach for 2 days and was not improved by the experience. He was carrying a leather case in a bad mood, and he went straight to the dining table where Evelyn had already spread the full case in the sequence she'd organized it. He read for 2 hours. She sat across from him and answered questions when he asked them, and let him take his time when he was working through something. When he looked up, he had a different face than the one he'd arrived with. "The Meridian Trust," he said. "I've heard that name." "Where?" "There was a case in Billings 3 years ago. Land company showed up with a claim against a mining operation, debt supposedly incurred 12 years prior. The mining company had no record of it. They paid the settlement to avoid the court costs. He looked at her. The case was never formally challenged. Because challenging it would have cost more than settling, she said. Exactly. He tapped the letter. This is the same play. Different property, different debt, same structure. Ownership? I've already started, he said. That's what I was doing on the coach, between sleeping terribly. He opened his leather case and pulled out his own set of notes. The trust is registered in Cheyenne under a holding company. That holding company has 2 directors. I can get you both names, but one of them I already know. He slid a paper across to her. She read the name. Willis Crane, the county surveying office manager, Holloway's brother-in-law. She sat back in her chair. He didn't just use Crane to suppress Pruitt's complaint, she said. He used him to set up the debt vehicle. One operation, Marsh said, multiple components, spread across enough time and enough separate legal entities that any single piece looks like ordinary business. He looked at her with the expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of being impressed. How long did it take you to put this together? 6 weeks, she said, give or take. If this had gone to someone who didn't already have a reason to dig, it would have worked, she said, completely. They sat with that for a moment. Cole came in from outside, brushing dust off his jacket. He looked at Marsh, then at Evelyn, and read something in the room that made him pull out the chair and sit down without being asked. Tell me, he said. She told him. By the time she finished, the gray outside had gone darker and the wind was picking up against the windows, and somewhere down the hall James had woken from his afternoon sleep and was making the interrogative sounds that meant he wanted to know where everyone was. Cole listened to all of it without interrupting. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. He's been running this for years, he said. Multiple properties? Possibly, Marsh said. I need more time to trace the trust's full history. But if the Billings case was the same mechanism, yes, the Whitaker Ranch may not be the only property he's done this to. Cole looked at Evelyn. That changes things. It changes the scope, she said. It doesn't change what we have to do next. What do we have to do next? He asked. Not rhetorically. He was asking her specifically. She folded her hands on the table. Marsh files the boundary dispute case and the fraudulent debt claim simultaneously before Holloway can move to tie up the court calendar. We need Pruitt's statement filed as supporting evidence. And we need to get ahead of whatever Holloway does when he realizes both cases are moving at once. He'll come at the ranch directly, Harlan said from the doorway. He's got nothing left to lose at that point. No one disagreed. Then we prepare for that, Evelyn said. The wind pushed against the house, and the lamp on the desk flickered once and held. Somewhere down the hall, James had stopped interrogating the empty room and gone quiet again. Probably found his way back to sleep, the deep, uncomplicated sleep of someone who didn't yet understand what the adults in his life were building to hold the ground beneath his feet. She would not let this fall apart. Not with James sleeping in a house that had started to feel like home in ways she hadn't agreed to and hadn't stopped. Marsh began organizing his papers into the sequence he'd need for filing. Cole looked at her across the table. Tomorrow, she said. We finish what's left and give Marsh everything he needs. Cole nodded. Outside, the wind kept coming off the mountain, steady and cold and indifferent. The way the land out here was always indifferent. Not hostile, just vast, requiring you to be equal to it or get out of the way. Evelyn Carter had never been good at getting out of the way. She pulled the lamp closer and kept working. Marsh left for Helena on Saturday morning with every document Evelyn had organized, copied, cross-referenced, and indexed into a case file that he described, with the particular restraint of a man who rarely said more than necessary, as the most thorough private legal preparation he had seen in 30 years of practice. She watched the stage pull away from the Granger stop and felt something she wasn't ready to call relief. More like the specific release of a breath held too long, followed immediately by the awareness that holding her breath again was going to be necessary very soon. Cole stood beside her on the boardwalk. He had his hat in his hands, turning it by the brim the way he did when he was thinking. How long before Holloway knows the filings are in? She asked. He'll know within a day of Marsh reaching Helena, Cole said. He's got contacts there, probably at the courthouse itself. Then we have a day. Maybe less. They rode back to the ranch in the kind of quiet that wasn't uncomfortable but wasn't easy either. The sky was that particular September blue that shows up in Montana like a promise it doesn't always keep, clear and deep and cold at the edges, the kind of sky that makes you want to believe everything is going to be fine right up until the moment it isn't. She spent the afternoon finishing the last 2 years of records she hadn't yet fully reconciled. It was slower going now because the urgency had shifted. The main case was in Marsh's hands, and what she was doing now was building the secondary layer, the financial picture that showed the pattern across time. She was doing it methodically, without rushing, and she was very aware that the methodical pace was partly because the work needed it, and partly because as long as she was working, she wasn't thinking about what came next. What came next was Holloway. She knew enough about him now to know how he moved. Patience first, years of it, while he set the pieces. Then acceleration when he sensed a threat. The writer who'd followed her from Pruitt's. The Meridian Trust letter arriving the same week they'd contacted Marsh. He didn't panic, but he pushed, and the pushing had a shape to it. She was building a prediction in the back of her mind the same way she built a financial ledger, item by item, matching cause to likely effect, correcting when the logic didn't hold. What she predicted was this: Holloway would not attack the legal case directly. Attacking the case required him to reveal how much he knew about its contents, and that would expose the network he'd used to build his position. Instead, he would go at the ranch, create operational chaos, something that forced Cole's attention outward and away from the courthouse, something that needed hands and horses and time, and while everyone was dealing with that, she stopped writing. She put down her pen and sat very still. While everyone was dealing with that, someone would come for the documents, not the copies in Marsh's possession. Those were already in Helena, but the originals. The originals were still here in the locked desk drawer, because Marsh had taken copies and she'd kept the originals as a safeguard. If the originals disappeared, if someone could get in here and take them while the ranch was occupied elsewhere, the case didn't collapse, but it got considerably harder. Copies without originals were weaker in court. A skilled opposing lawyer could raise questions about authenticity, about alterations, about chain of custody. Holloway would know this. A man who'd spent years building this particular kind of scheme would absolutely know this. She went to find Cole, who was in the equipment barn with Harlan and Eddie, checking the fence wire inventory, which was the practical work of a man who expected his fences to be cut in the near future and was trying to be realistic about his response capacity. "I need to move the documents," she said. Cole looked at her. "Where?" "Somewhere off the ranch. Somewhere Holloway wouldn't think to look." She'd been turning this over on the walk from the house. If he sends men here, to the house, while everyone's dealing with something in the north pasture, he goes for the records, Cole finished. He goes for the records. Harlan crossed his arms. "Mrs. Draper's sister lives in town," he said, "above the dress shop. Nobody connects her to any of this." Evelyn considered that. Would she keep something without asking what it was? "She's kept Harlan's whiskey for 12 years. Mrs. Draper's voice came from the barn door, where she was standing with a look that suggested she'd been listening for longer than any of them realized. "She can keep a folder." Evelyn looked at Cole. Cole looked at Harlan. Harlan looked at Mrs. Draper with the expression of a man who'd long ago accepted that the women in his life were considerably more competent than he gave them credit for. "Tonight," Evelyn said. "I'll take them in myself after dark." "You're not going alone," Cole said. "I'm harder to notice than you are," she said. "A woman carrying a parcel after dark is unremarkable. A Whitaker riding into town at night is not." She could see him working through the logic and not liking where it went. "I'll take Mrs. Draper," she said. "2 women going to her sister's. Entirely ordinary." Mrs. Draper nodded once, as if this had already been decided and they were just catching up. Cole was quiet for a moment. "Be back before midnight." "We'll be back by 10, Evelyn said. They were back by 9:45, which was not something she mentioned to Cole, because she'd said 10 and arriving early felt like showing off. The documents were in a locked box in the back of a wardrobe at Mrs. Draper's sister's house, which smelled like lavender and old wool and the particular stuffiness of a room that had too many things in it and not enough windows. The sister, a small, angular woman named Ruth, who had the same practical face as Mrs. Draper and the same absolute lack of interest in unnecessary questions, had accepted the box without comment, locked it, handed Evelyn the key, and gone back to her mending. Evelyn liked her immediately. On the ride back, the night was clear and cold, and the stars were the kind of thick and present that you don't see anywhere near a city, just out here where the dark was real dark, and the light that was left was worth looking at. Mrs. Draper sat beside her in the wagon and didn't talk, which was the thing Evelyn had come to value most about her. She understood when silence was the right answer. "Mrs. Draper," Evelyn said about halfway back. How long have you worked for Cole?" "Since his mother died. 11 years. What was he like before, sort before his father got sick, before all of this?" Mrs. Draper thought about it. Not the fake thinking people do before they say something they'd already decided. Actual consideration. "Easier," she said finally. "Not easier as a person. Easier in himself. Like a man who knows where he stands." She looked ahead at the road. When the ranch started struggling, he thought it was him. Thought he'd done something wrong, managed something badly. I went over it in his head for years. You could see it on him. Evelyn kept her eyes on the horse. "He doesn't do that anymore," Mrs. Draper said. "Not since you started going through the records." She didn't answer that. "I'm not saying anything by it," Mrs. Draper said. "Just observing." "I know," Evelyn said. They rode the rest of the way in silence, and Evelyn sat with what Mrs. Draper had said and tried to be honest with herself about what she did with it. It was information. It was context. It did not need to be anything more than that. She was very good at deciding what things needed to be, and considerably less good at making that decision stick. Holloway moved on the third day after Marsh filed. It happened at 4 in the morning, which was, she understood afterward, specifically chosen because 4 in the morning was the hour when the body's systems ran lowest and slowest, when watchmen got drowsy and horses were quiet, and the mind played tricks, and told you that the sound you heard was just the wind. It wasn't the wind. What it was, specifically, was 6 men cutting the north fence line in 3 places simultaneously, driving approximately 80 head of cattle through the gaps before Eddie and the 2 men on watch could organize a response. By the time the alarm reached the main house and Cole was pulling his boots on, the cattle were scattered across the open range north of the property line and moving further in the dark. Cole was out the door in 4 minutes. Harlan was already on his horse. Eddie and 2 other hands came behind. Evelyn stood in the kitchen doorway and listened to the sound of them riding out and held herself perfectly still for 30 seconds, running through the logic of it. 6 men, 3 fence cuts, 80 cattle, 4 in the morning, all of Cole's best people, riding north into the dark to solve a problem that would take hours. She went back inside and woke Mrs. Draper. "Stay with James," she said. Mrs. Draper was already sitting up. "What are you doing?" "Staying here?" She went to the office. The desk was locked. She'd kept the key on her person since moving the originals to Ruth's. She unlocked it and checked the contents. The copies she'd kept as backup were still there, untouched. She relocked it. Then she sat in the dark in the chair behind the desk, with the lamp off, and the room black except for the thin light coming under the door from the hall, and she waited. She was not good at waiting. She was aware of that about herself. But she was better at waiting than most people because she'd had practice in the train station, and the train station had taught her that waiting wasn't passive. Waiting was a form of decision you kept renewing, minute by minute, the decision to stay still and trust what you knew. What she knew was this. The cattle incident was a distraction. The question was what it was distracting from. She heard the horse at 40 minutes in, not galloping, walking, coming from the east side of the property, not the north where Cole had gone, deliberate and quiet, the gait of an animal being handled carefully by someone who didn't want to make noise. She heard it reach the yard. She heard boots on the porch steps. She heard the front door handle turn and not turn because she had bolted it from the inside after Cole left. There was a pause, then a window being tested at the side of the house. She'd checked all the windows after Cole left. They were latched. She heard the window stop, then silence for about a minute, during which she sat in the dark and breathed through her nose and kept her hands flat on the desk in front of her. Then she heard whoever it was walk back to the horse and mount up and ride away. She let out a breath. She sat in the dark for another hour until she heard Cole and the others coming back. Not with all the cattle, she'd learned later. They'd only recovered about half before the dark made it impossible. And then she unlocked the office door and went to meet him in the kitchen. He looked at her face and understood immediately that something had happened here while he was gone. She told him, quietly and precisely, while Mrs. Draper made coffee that no one particularly needed, but that gave everyone something to do with their hands. Cole listened without interrupting. When she was done, he said, "He sent a man here." "Yes." "While we were all north." "Yes." "You stayed." It wasn't accusatory, it was something else, something she would have had trouble naming. "I thought he would," she said. "I should have told you before you left, but there wasn't time and I wasn't entirely sure. You should have woken one of the men who stayed behind. You shouldn't have been in here alone." "I know," she said. And she did know. She'd understood, sitting in the dark, that it was not a wise thing to do alone. But she'd also understood that the man outside wasn't going to break down a bolted door, because breaking down a door created noise and witnesses, and a different kind of legal exposure than Holloway could afford right now. He'd sent someone to try the quiet way, and when the quiet way didn't work, they left. "The documents are at Ruth's," she said. "Whatever he was looking for, he didn't find it." Cole looked at her across the kitchen table. He was dirty from the ride and tired in the specific way that went deeper than sleep, and there was a cut on his hand. He probably hadn't noticed from catching a fence wire in the dark. He looked like a man who'd been fighting the same battle for years and had started to wonder if the battle had an end. "Cole," she said. He looked at her. "We're ahead of him," she said. "We have been since we found the Keller parcel. He's reacting to us now, not the other way around. Tonight was him trying to get back in front, and it didn't work." "He'll try again. Let him." She said it without heat, just as a fact. Every time he tries, he exposes more of what he is. Marsh is watching from Helena. The judge assigned to the boundary case is not one of Holloway's, but Marsh made sure of it. The filings are in, and they're documented and dated, and they exist in a record that Holloway can't reach. Cole was quiet. "You can't fix the cattle tonight," she said. "And you can't fix the fence line tonight. But both of those things are fixable. They're expensive, and they're exhausting, and they're exactly what he wants you to spend the next week focused on." She paused. "Don't give him that." He looked at her for a long moment. "What do I give him instead?" "Nothing," she said. "You go to sleep. In the morning, you send word to Marsh that Holloway sent a man to the house tonight, and it failed. That becomes part of the record, too." She looked at him steadily. "Every move he makes now is evidence. He's building our case for us." Something in Cole's face shifted. Not all at once, piece by piece, the tension releasing in the specific way it does when a person finally believes that someone else has actually thought it through. He picked up his coffee. "The cut on your hand needs to be cleaned," she said. He looked down at it like he was seeing it for the first time. "It's fine." "It's not fine. It's a fence wire cut in October in Montana. Mrs. Draper, would you—" "Already ahead of you," Mrs. Draper said from the other side of the kitchen, producing a cloth and a tin of salve with the efficiency of someone who'd been tending working men's injuries for the better part of a decade. Cole submitted to having his hand cleaned with the particular resigned grace of a man who'd learned not to argue with Mrs. Draper about medical matters. Evelyn went to check on James, who was asleep with one arm over the edge of the small bed and his mouth slightly open, and an expression of complete unconcerned contentment that she found, in this moment, nearly unbearable in its preciousness. She stood in the doorway longer than she needed to. Then she went back to the kitchen and sat down and let herself be tired for a few minutes, which was a luxury she didn't often allow, and which tonight she felt she'd earned. The hearing date came down from the district court on a Tuesday, 3 weeks from that Friday. Marsh wired the news along with a summary of the judge's preliminary review, which described the boundary dispute filing as presenting substantial evidence requiring full evidentiary hearing and indicated that the fraudulent debt claim had been referred to a separate investigative review given what Marsh had been able to establish about the Meridian Trust's history. Willis Crane had resigned from the county surveying office the same morning the Meridian Trust filing hit the court record. He had not yet given a statement, but his resignation was, Marsh wrote, its own kind of statement. She read the wire 3 times and then went outside to find Cole. He was in the south pasture checking on a section of fence that had been repaired after a legitimate weather incident, not one of Holloway's, just actual Montana autumn weather doing what it did. He was on his horse, standing still, looking at the line of fence, with the particular expression he got when he was thinking about something that had nothing to do with the fence. She rode out on the horse she'd started using regularly over the past few weeks. a bay mare named Dora, whom she'd initially been nervous around and had since developed something close to a working friendship with, based largely on mutual respect, and Evelyn always remembering where the good patch of grass was near the equipment barn. She pulled up beside him and handed over the wire without saying anything. He read it again. 3 weeks, he said. 3 weeks. He folded the wire and handed it back, kept looking at the fence line. Holloway's going to make a move before the hearing. Probably. A big one. Possibly. She looked at the fence, too. It was good work, straight, tight, the kind that would hold through winter. Eddie had done it. But Marsh has already filed the attempted break-in at the house as supplementary evidence of interference. Holloway's lawyers know that anything he does now goes directly into the case record against him. That doesn't stop him, Cole said. It just means he has to decide if it's worth it. What does he value more than winning? Cole thought about that. His reputation, he said after a moment. In this county, his reputation is everything. He's built his whole position on being untouchable. The moment people start believing he's not, he starts losing, she finished. He loses money. He loses influence. He loses the other schemes he's running that we haven't even found yet. Cole turned on his horse to look at her directly. What are you thinking? She'd been working on this since the wire arrived. Not all of it had settled into clear shape yet, but enough of it had. The hearing is 3 weeks away, she said. Before it happens, this county's people need to know what Holloway has done. Not rumors, facts. The supply contract fraud, the survey, the Meridian Trust. Because Holloway's power in this county isn't legal, it's social. People do business with him because they're afraid of him or they think he's winning. If they know he's not, you want to tell people, Cole said. I want to tell the right people. The ones he's done business with. The ones who might have their own supply irregularities they've never looked at too closely. The ones who've sold him land and wondered afterward if the price was right. Cole was very still. Not gossip, she said, not hearsay. A meeting. Here, if you're willing, invite people you trust, ranchers, business people, and show them the pattern. What Marsh has filed is public record now. Anyone can read it. We'd just be helping them understand what it means. He'll say it's slander. It's not slander if it's in the court record, and we're describing the court record accurately. Cole looked at her for a long moment. The wind was cold and smelled like coming snow, the first real hint of winter sliding down off the mountain. And somewhere behind them, the horses in the south pasture were moving together the way horses did when weather was coming. How many people are you thinking? He asked. 8 or 10, enough to carry the information outward without it being a mob. People talk. That's usually a problem. In this case, we want them to. Cole turned his horse back toward the ranch. She fell in beside him. Saturday, he said. I'll send word to the people I trust. Good. They rode for a minute in silence. Evelyn, he said. She looked at him. I want to ask you something, and I'd like you to answer it honestly, even if you think the honest answer isn't what I want to hear. All right. When this is over, when the case is settled and Holloway's done and the records are straight, what are you going to do? She kept her eyes on the trail ahead of them. Her first instinct was to give him the practical answer, the answer about employment and arrangements and what made sense logistically. But he'd specifically asked for the honest one, and those were not always the same thing. I don't know, she said. That's honest, he said. I haven't let myself think about it, she admitted. I've been putting it in the same place I put things I can't solve yet, the box I close when the lid gets too heavy. What would it take for you to think about it? She looked at him. He was watching the trail, not her, which she recognized as a form of courtesy, giving her the question without the pressure of being watched while she answered it. Time, she said, and the hearing being over, and, she paused, and knowing what I'm deciding from, whether I'd be staying because it made sense or because I wanted to. Those aren't always the same thing, and I'd need to be sure which one it was. He nodded slowly. Fair enough, he said, and didn't push it further. They reached the yard and separated. He went to the barn, she went to the house, and Mrs. Draper met her at the door with James on her hip, and a look that said very plainly that the baby had been fed and changed and was now bored and wanted his mother, so whatever she'd been doing out there, she could continue doing it later. Evelyn took James and held him and pressed her face into the side of his neck where he still smelled like a baby and not yet like a boy, and she let herself have that for a minute. one thing at a time. The Saturday gathering was 11 people. Ranchers, 2 shopkeepers, a woman who ran the boarding house and knew everything that happened in Granger before it happened anywhere else. Cole had chosen carefully, people with reason to listen, people with enough standing that when they talked, it would carry weight. Evelyn set the documents in order on the dining room table. She had prepared what she was going to say the way she prepared everything, methodically, with the weak points identified and addressed before anyone else could find them. She was not by nature a person comfortable being at the center of a room. She was better at the desk than the podium. But this was a version of the desk, a collection of figures that told a story, and her job was to walk people through the arithmetic. She walked them through it, no flourishes, no appeals to emotion. The facts were emotional enough on their own. She showed them the survey. She showed them the original deed. She showed them the Keller parcel and the Meridian Trust and the supply contract structure. And she showed them the timeline that connected all of it, which made clear that this had been running for years before anyone thought to look. The room was very quiet throughout. When she was done, one of the ranchers, a man named Aldous Burke, who had a property 2 valleys over and a reputation for skepticism, said, "How do we know Holloway's supply contracts aren't all like this?" "You don't," she said, "unless you check." Burke looked at Cole. "You should have said something sooner." "We didn't know," Cole said evenly. "That was the point." "I have 3 years of supply records in my office," said the boarding house woman. Her name was Clara Webb, and she had the specific briskness of someone who'd built her own business from nothing and had opinions about people who tried to take things from others. "I'm going to go through every line when I get home." "Write down anything that looks irregular," Evelyn said. "Date, amount, what was agreed versus what was charged. If you find something, send a note to Everett Marsh and Helena. His address is on that paper." She'd prepared a page for each of them. "Even if you think it's small, small things add up." Burke was still looking at her with the assessment he'd been running since she started speaking. "Where are you from?" he asked. "Boston," she said. "How'd you end up at the Whitaker Ranch?" "Train station," she said. "It was raining." There was a beat of silence, and then Clara Webb made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a snort, and the specific tension that had been holding the room careful and formal loosened by a noticeable degree. After the gathering, when people had talked among themselves and taken their papers and said their goodbyes, and ridden or walked or driven back toward their own properties, Evelyn sat at the table with the empty cups and the lamp burning low and the feeling of having used every single thing she had. She didn't hear Cole come back in from seeing the last guests off. She just became aware that he was there, sitting across from her, with 2 fresh cups of coffee he'd apparently gone to the kitchen and made himself. He pushed one across the table to her. She picked it up. "Clara Webb," she said, "is going to find something in those supply records." "Probably," Cole said. "Burke too." "Burke doesn't like admitting he's been had," Cole said. "But yeah, he'll look. When they find it, they'll bring it to Marsh. And Marsh can use it to show that the Whitaker case isn't an isolated grievance. It's part of a countywide pattern." She wrapped her hands around the cup. "That changes what the judge is looking at. It becomes a different kind of case." "A bigger kind," Cole said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "You thought of all this when?" "The wire came on Tuesday," she said. "I've been working on the shape of it since then." "You didn't tell me until Wednesday." "I needed to be sure it was solid before I brought it to you. There's no point in half-built plans." He looked at her across the table. The lamp was low and the room was quiet, and outside the wind had died down, and it was the kind of still that came before real cold. "Evelyn," he said, "I want you to know something." She waited. "Whatever you decide, Chet," he said carefully, with the precision of someone who had thought about their words before saying them, "about what you're doing next, after the hearing. Whatever you decide, I'm going to respect it. If you want to go, I understand. If you want to build something here, some kind of arrangement, professional or otherwise, I'd like that. But I'm not going to make any of that harder for you. You've carried enough weight that wasn't yours to carry." She held his gaze. "That's a very careful speech." "I wrote most of it in my head riding back from the south fence on Thursday," he said. "I know," she said. "I could tell." Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, but the closest thing to it she'd seen from him in weeks. "What did I give away?" he asked. "You never say professional or otherwise," she said. "That's not how you talk." That was a phrase you put in deliberately because you needed it there and didn't know how else to put it. He looked at her. You're very hard to say things to, he said, without being seen through. I know, she said again. I've been told. Does it bother you when people say that? She thought about it honestly. It used to, she said. It used to make me feel like I was doing something wrong, like I was supposed to be less, she looked for the word, less present than I am. You're not, he said, less present. No, she agreed. I'm not. The fire in the main room was down to coals, and the cold was starting to come through at the edges of the windows. And somewhere upstairs, James was beginning to stir in the first movements of his early morning waking, which meant she had maybe 20 minutes before he was fully awake and demanding the world account for itself. She stood up and collected the cups. Cole, she said. He looked up at her. Ask me again, she said. After the hearing, when I know what I'm deciding from. He was quiet for a moment. All right, he said. I'm not saying no, she said, because she felt that needed to be clear. I know, he said. I'm saying I need to know that I'm staying for the right reasons, and I don't know that yet. I understand, he said. And she believed him, not because he was the kind of man who said what people wanted to hear, but because he was the kind of man who didn't. She went upstairs. James was awake, standing in the small bed with both hands on the rail, looking at the door with the expression of a person who'd been waiting a very reasonable amount of time for someone to come and explain why morning kept happening. She picked him up and held him against her shoulder and went to the window. The sky outside was the color that comes right before real dawn. Not dark anymore, not light. Something in between. That doesn't have a proper name, but that she'd grown to know out here the way she'd never known it in Boston, where the buildings swallowed the in-between and you went from dark to day without the transition. The ranch was quiet below. The horses were moving slowly in the near pasture. The fence lines that Eddie had repaired stood straight against the pale field. 3 weeks to the hearing. One more move from Holloway. She was sure of it. She could feel the shape of it the way you feel weather before it arrives. She was ready. She pressed her face into James's hair and looked out at the brightening land and thought about what Cole had said and what she'd said back. And she let herself, just for a moment, feel the full weight of everything she'd built here and everything she stood to lose if it fell apart. That was the thing about finally having something worth keeping. It made you understand, in a way you couldn't from the outside, what people who had always had it felt they were defending. Now she was defending it too. James grabbed a fistful of her hair with both hands and tugged decisively. I know, she said. Breakfast. She went downstairs. Holloway's last move came on a Wednesday, 8 days before the hearing, and it was not what she'd predicted. She'd predicted something physical. Another fence line. Cattle again? Or maybe the water channel that fed the north pasture, which was vulnerable in 3 places she'd identified and mentioned to Cole, who had quietly stationed Eddie near the weakest one. She'd predicted something designed to create cost and chaos, the kind of move a man made when he was trying to bleed the other side before a decision came down. What Holloway did instead was go to the newspaper. The Granger Courier was a weekly paper with a circulation of perhaps 400 printed on Thursdays, and its editor was a man named Paul Strickland, who had a reputation for being independent that was, Evelyn now understood, only partially accurate. The story that ran under Strickland's byline described the pending district court case as a dispute between a prominent regional businessman and a struggling ranch operation, and included a paragraph, carefully worded, nothing technically false, suggesting that the key evidence in the case had been assembled by an itinerant woman from Boston with no formal legal training and no established ties to the community, who had arrived in Granger under unclear circumstances and taken up residence on the property at the center of the dispute. The word itinerant. She read it twice. Clara Webb brought her a copy of the paper before noon on Thursday, arriving at the ranch with the expression of a woman who had read something that made her angry and wanted the person most affected to know she was angry on their behalf. Evelyn read the piece at the kitchen table. Then she folded the paper and set it down and looked at the window for a moment. He's trying to discredit the evidence by discrediting you, Clara said. Yes. It's not going to work. No, Evelyn said. But that's not the point. The point is to make Cole question whether having me involved makes things worse for him, to make the community wonder whether the case rests on solid ground or on a stranger's word. She looked at the paper. It's smart, actually. given that he's run out of the other options. Clara made a sound that expressed her opinion of that assessment. Cole came in from outside while she was still sitting at the table. He'd seen the paper. She could tell from his face that he'd seen it before she had. Someone in town had probably found him first, the way people always find the person the story is about before anyone thinks to warn them. He sat down across from her. He's going after you personally. I know. Because everything else he tried didn't work. That's right. Does it? He stopped, started again. How are you? She considered the honest answer, which was that she was angrier than she'd been at any point in this entire process, and that the anger was specific and clean, not the hot, destabilizing kind, but the cold, clarifying kind that made her think faster. And underneath the anger was something more complicated because the word itinerant had found a place to land that she'd have preferred it hadn't, somewhere near the part of her that still occasionally woke at 3 in the morning and did arithmetic on how much she'd given up and whether it was going to be worth it. I'm fine, she said, which was true enough. Cole looked at her steadily. He knew what he was doing when he wrote it that way. Yes. I can go to Strickland, tell him the story was misleading. That would look like exactly the kind of panic Holloway wants, she said. It would suggest the article hit something real. She picked up the paper and set it aside, face down. What helps us is the same thing that's been helping us. The record. What I am doesn't change what I found. And what I found is in a courthouse in Helena in Everett Marsh's handwriting, with Pruitt's signed statement attached. And neither of those things gets less true because a newspaper called me itinerant. Cole was quiet. What I need you to do, she said, is not react to this in a way that gives Holloway a second story. He called you a transient in a public paper. I know what he called me. And you want me to do nothing. She looked at him directly. I want you to trust that the work we've done is enough. Because it is. She paused. Is it enough for you, regardless of what anyone thinks of me? He held her gaze. That's not a fair question. It's the only one that matters right now. He was quiet for a long moment. The kitchen was warm, and outside the wind was carrying the first real smell of winter. And somewhere upstairs, James was awake and narrating something to himself in the particular one-sided conversation of a toddler who has decided the world is listening, even when it clearly isn't. Yes, Cole said. It's enough. She nodded once. Then let's not give him anything else. Clara Webb, as it turned out, did not share Evelyn's restraint. Not in a damaging way. Clara was too smart for that. But on Friday morning, the day after the paper ran, Clara Webb held what she described as a casual coffee at the boarding house, to which she invited 7 women, all of whom were married to or ran businesses with the men who'd attended the Saturday gathering at the Whitaker Ranch. Evelyn was not there. She heard about it afterward from Mrs. Draper, who heard it from Ruth, who heard it from a woman named Josephine Burke, Aldous Burke's wife, who had apparently been the most forthcoming of the group. What Clara had done was simple. She'd brought her own supply records, the ones she'd gone through after the Saturday gathering. She'd found 11 months of overcharges, smaller than Cole's, but consistent with the same structure. And she'd spread them on the table and let the women in the room look at them and draw their own conclusions. She hadn't mentioned the newspaper article. She didn't have to. By Sunday, 4 more people had written to Marsh with their own records. By Monday, there was a second story in the Granger Courier, a shorter one, tucked below the fold on the front page, reporting that the district court case regarding the Whitaker Ranch had attracted supporting documentation from multiple county residents and that the scope of the investigation had been formally expanded. Strickland had written this one differently, less comfortable, the language of a man who had looked at which way something was going and made a practical decision. She read it and felt something she couldn't immediately name settle in her chest. Not triumph. Triumph was too clean, and nothing about any of this had been clean. More like the particular feeling of watching something you built hold weight you weren't completely sure it could carry, and finding out it could. She put the paper down and went back to work. Awesome. The hearing was on a Friday. Marsh had advised Cole and Evelyn to be present, and he'd advised them to bring the original documents, which meant a trip to Ruth's on Thursday evening to collect the locked box, a drive that Evelyn made with Cole in a silence that was not uncomfortable but was full of things neither of them was saying. They stayed in Granger Thursday night. Cole at the hotel, Evelyn and James at Ruth's, an arrangement Ruth accepted without comment, and Mrs. Draper had packed for with the thoroughness of a woman who understood that important things required clean clothes. She did not sleep much, not because she was afraid, she'd moved past fear, or past that particular kind of it, but because her mind kept running through the documents in sequence, checking and rechecking the connections, the way she'd always done before something that mattered. It was not productive. She knew it wasn't productive. She did it anyway, because some habits were older than reason. James slept beside her, enormous in the way small children become enormous when they take up space in a way that has nothing to do with their physical size, and she listened to him breathe and thought about the train station, about standing in the rain with $2 in her shoe and a letter in her pocket that had dismantled in 23 words everything she'd sold her mother's brooch to build. She thought about what it would mean if she'd stayed in that station, if she'd wired her cousin, if she'd decided that the right thing was to go back where she knew the edges of things and the territory was familiar, and the failure was at least a failure she understood. She thought about all the decisions she'd made by not quite deciding, by just doing the next thing that needed doing, and then the next one, and then the one after that, until she looked up and found herself 6 weeks deep in someone else's land records in a ranch house in Montana, building a legal case against a man who'd spent years believing he was untouchable. At some point, the thinking gave way to something that wasn't quite sleep, but was close enough. And when Ruth knocked on the door at 6 in the morning with coffee and a look that asked no questions and expected no explanation, Evelyn was already sitting up. The district courthouse in Helena smelled like old wood and ink and the particular dry heat of a building that has been heated with the same stoves for 30 years. The hearing room was not large. It seated perhaps 40 people, and by the time the judge took his place behind the bench, most of those seats were occupied. She recognized Aldous Burke in the third row, Clara Webb beside him, two of the other ranchers from Saturday. Pruitt sat near the back, alone, with his hands folded and his eyes forward. Holloway was at the opposite table with two lawyers, both of whom had the well-fed, unhurried look of men who were paid enough to be confident in nearly any room. Holloway himself sat straight and still, the way he always did, and looked at nothing in particular with the expression of a man who had decided in advance how this was going to go. She watched him for a moment. Then she turned back to the table where she sat beside Marsh, with the documents stacked in order in front of her, and she did not look at Holloway again. Marsh was good. She'd known he was good, but watching him in the room was different from working with him at the kitchen table. He had a courtroom economy. Nothing wasted, nothing said for sound rather than substance. Every question he asked arriving with the specific patience of a man who already knew what the answer was going to do. Pruitt testified. His voice was steady. He told the court exactly what he'd written in his statement and answered the cross-examination from Holloway's lawyers with the particular composure of a man who'd already reckoned with his own part in things and wasn't going to pretend otherwise. When they pressed him on why he hadn't come forward sooner, he said, "Because I was afraid, and I was wrong to be." And the room was quiet for a moment after. The Meridian Trust documentation went in through Marsh, who walked the judge through the connection to Willis Crane with the methodical clarity of someone laying track, one piece at a time, each one connecting to the next, until the picture was complete. Holloway's lawyers objected several times. The judge overruled most of it. When Marsh introduced the supply contract evidence, the overcharges, the additional documentation from Burke and Clara Webb, and the others, one of Holloway's lawyers said something in a low voice to the other, and the other one made a small gesture that Evelyn read as acknowledging something they'd hoped wouldn't be as thorough as it was. She had done her job. She knew she had done it. But she sat very still and kept her hands quiet and waited. The hearing ran until 4 in the afternoon. The judge did not rule from the bench that day. He said he would issue his findings within 2 weeks, which Marsh later told her was, in his experience, the posture of a judge who had made up his mind and needed the 2 weeks to write it properly. She walked out of the courthouse into the Helena afternoon, which was cold and bright and smelled like pine and horse and the distant metallic smell of rail iron, and she stood on the steps for a moment and breathed. Cole was beside her. He had said almost nothing during the hearing. Marsh had advised it, and Cole had the discipline to follow advice he trusted, but she could feel how much the Pruitt testimony had cost him to sit through. Someone telling a room full of people exactly how his father's work had been taken from him, piece by piece, while his father was alive and couldn't understand why things were falling apart. She didn't say anything. She just stood beside him and let the afternoon be what it was. After a moment, he said, "Thank you." She looked at him. "I know you've heard it," he said. "I know I've said versions of it, but I want you to know that it's not about the records. It's not even about the case." He looked at the steps, then back at her. "My father died thinking he'd failed, and because of what you did, that's not going to be the last word on it." He paused. "That matters to me more than any boundary line." She held his gaze. "He didn't fail," she said, "and now there's a court record that says so." Cole nodded. He looked like a man who had been carrying something for a long time and had just, very carefully, set it down. Check. The judge's findings came in 11 days, not 2 weeks. Marsh wired them to the ranch, and Evelyn read the wire at the kitchen desk on a Tuesday morning while James sat on the floor beside her and attempted to dismantle a wooden toy horse with the methodical determination he'd inherited from someone. The boundary dispute was resolved in favor of the Whitaker Ranch. The original deed superseded the 1889 survey. The eastern boundary was to be re-established according to the deed's specifications, and the cost of the resurvey was to be borne by the party whose fraudulent documentation had necessitated it. The Meridian Trust debt claim was dismissed with prejudice and referred to the district attorney for investigation of fraud. Willis Crane was named in the referral. Grant Holloway's attorneys had, according to a second wire from Marsh, arrived at his office the morning before the findings were issued to discuss a settlement offer. Marsh had told them the time for settlement was the period before the filing, and that window was closed. She set the wires down on the desk and sat back in her chair. James held up a piece of the disassembled horse and examined it with great seriousness. "Good job," she told him, which was not the lesson she'd intended to reinforce, but she was tired in the best possible way and felt charitable toward small, destructive people. She went to find Cole. He was, as he often was in the morning, somewhere between the barn and the north pasture, not avoiding the house, just the particular geography of a man whose instinct was to be moving when he was thinking. She found him at the fence line Eddie had repaired, looking north at the land that was now, legally and completely, what it had always actually been. She handed him the wires without saying anything. He read them standing at the fence. She watched his face. He read them twice. Then he folded them carefully, edges aligned the way she'd taught him, and put them in his coat pocket. He looked out at the north pasture for a long time. Then he said, "It's over." "The legal part," she said. "Holloway's going to have a difficult few years, but he's not your problem anymore." "No," Cole said. "He's not." The wind off the mountain was cold but not brutal. The particular cold of a late autumn day that knows winter is coming but isn't there yet, that still has something of the year's warmth in it underneath the chill. "Evelyn," he said. She waited. "I believe I said I would ask you again, after the hearing." "The hearing was 11 days ago," she said. "I know." He turned to face her. "I wanted to give you 11 days. She looked at him. He looked back, and he had the expression he wore when he wasn't going to fill the silence, which was its own kind of patience she'd come to understand as something he'd earned, not just practiced. She had spent the 11 days doing what she'd told him she needed to do, trying to be honest with herself about what she was deciding from. Whether she was staying because it made sense or because she wanted to. Whether the practical reasons and the other reasons were so tangled together that she couldn't separate them. She decided, somewhere around day 7, that the inability to fully separate them was itself an answer. "I want to stay," she said. "That's the honest answer. I've been trying to figure out if I want to stay because it's sensible or because I want to. And I've decided that the wanting doesn't become less real just because it also makes sense." Cole was very still. "James is happy here," she said, "and the work matters to me. And—" She stopped, then made herself finish it. "You matter to me. Not because you helped me in the rain, although you did. Because of everything since. Because of who you are when things are hard." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not easy to be around," he said. "No," she agreed. "Neither am I. I don't say the right thing half the time." "You said it when it counted," she said. "That's a better average than most." He reached out and took her hand, which was not a dramatic gesture but was the most deliberate one she'd seen him make. And she let him hold it, and they stood at the fence line looking north at land that was his again, in full, because she had looked closely at what other people had stopped looking at. "I'll need a formal arrangement," she said after a moment. "Something with proper terms. I'm not going to just be a woman who lives on your ranch under unclear circumstances." "No," he said. "I wouldn't ask that. The accounts need continued management. That's real work, and it should be compensated properly." "Agreed. And whatever else," she paused, because this part was harder to say in daylight at a fence line with the wind in her face. "Whatever else this becomes, it becomes at the pace it actually becomes. I'm not going to hurry it, and I'm not going to be hurried." "Understood," he said, and she believed him. She looked out at the north pasture. "Your father would have liked seeing those boundary markers put back where they belong." "Yes," Cole said quietly. "He would have." They stood there for a while. Not long. There was work to do. There was always work to do. But long enough that it felt like something acknowledged, something named. The winter came hard and stayed long, the way Montana winters do, and the Whitaker Ranch moved through it the way ranches do, with daily work and daily problems, and the specific rhythm of a place that runs because people keep running it. Evelyn managed the accounts, which had been officially formalized in a written agreement that Marsh had drawn up and that she'd read carefully 3 times before signing, because she read everything carefully 3 times, and she was not going to stop on account of sentiment. The agreement named her as ranch manager with a clear compensation structure and defined responsibilities, and Cole had signed it without negotiating a single term, which she suspected was less about agreement and more about having learned which battles she would win. She had been right about Clara Webb. Clara had filed her own complaint with the district attorney about the supply overcharges, and 3 more businesses had followed. Holloway's broader network was under investigation by the spring, and the county knew it. The ease he'd moved through Granger for years, the way people stepped aside and agreed and didn't push back, was gone. Not all at once. Quietly, the way his power had been built, it unwound. He left the county in March. No announcement. Just gone one day, his house shuttered, his operation handed to creditors. Evelyn heard about it from Mrs. Draper, who heard it from Ruth, who had it from the sheriff's deputy who handled the inventory. She felt nothing particular about it. Not satisfaction. Satisfaction required ongoing engagement with a person, and she'd stopped engaging with Holloway the morning the wires came. Just the clean factual awareness that a thing was done. James turned 2 in April. I was by that point capable of saying approximately 40 words, 12 of which were names of horses, and he had developed a strong opinion about which boots he wore that bore no relationship to weather or practicality, a trait Evelyn recognized with a complicated feeling as something he'd gotten from her. Cole taught him to sit on a horse in May. Not ride, but sit. With Cole's hands steady on either side and the gentlest horse on the property standing patient, and enormous beneath a 2-year-old who had absolutely no fear of anything, which was a quality Evelyn was going to have to address at some point in the future when he was old enough to understand what fear was for. She watched from the fence and felt the specific fullness of something that had no single name but was made up of many things. The morning in the rain, the train station, the record spread on the kitchen table at midnight, Pruitt's voice in a courtroom telling the truth. After too long keeping it, Cole at the fence line taking her hand in the cold. None of it had been smooth. None of it had gone the way she planned, because she hadn't been able to plan it. It had accumulated, piece by piece, decision by decision, each one made in the absence of certainty, because certainty was a luxury she'd never been able to afford. That was the thing she'd learned, the thing she hadn't known to look for when she got on the train in Boston with her mother's brooch already sold and her plan already falling apart. That the life you end up with is almost never the one you arranged. It's the one you build in the gaps between what you expected and what actually showed up at the station. What actually showed up at the station, in her case, had been rain and an empty platform and 23 words and a man she didn't know who offered her a ride because it was raining and she had a baby. That was it. That was the whole hinge. And because of that hinge, because of that ordinary, unremarkable moment of one person deciding to stop and another person deciding to accept, there was now a boy sitting on a horse in the May sunshine, with a Montana rancher's hands holding him steady, laughing at something the horse was doing with its ears. She looked at Cole and he looked at her across James's delighted head. She thought about the train station sometimes, not with grief anymore, but with the particular clarity that difficult moments take on, once you're standing in a place where you can see them from far enough away. Robert Aldrin and his 23 words had not destroyed her life. He had, in the manner of people who abandon us, accidentally pointed it somewhere else. Somewhere it turned out she was supposed to be, though she hadn't known it, and he certainly hadn't planned it. There was no lesson in that she could wrap up cleanly. Life didn't work that way. You couldn't tell someone, be abandoned in a rain-soaked station, follow a stranger home, spend 6 weeks in the accounting records of someone else's crisis, fall into a life you never looked for. That wasn't advice. That was just what happened. What she could say, what she believed, standing at that fence in the spring light, was this. The thing that had saved her was not luck, and it was not rescue. It was the decision, made in that station with $2 in her shoe and a baby against her chest, to take the next step and then the step after that. To stay occupied. To not let fear sit still in her long enough to become permanent. To trust that she knew how to read the numbers, and that the numbers eventually told the truth. She had never needed saving. She had needed time and a warm room and a problem she could solve, and then another problem, and then another one, until one day she looked up and everything she'd been reaching for was already in her hands. Cole brought James back to the fence and handed him to her, and James grabbed her collar with both fists and looked up at her with Cole's same directness wearing her own determined expression, which was a combination she was going to have her hands full with for the next 20 years, and knew it. Again, James said, meaning the horse. Later, she said. Again, he said, with complete confidence that this was a reasonable position. He's got your stubbornness, Cole said. He's got yours, she said. Mine is systematic. His is just loud. Cole's expression did the thing it did sometimes. Not quite a smile, but the sustained possibility of one. The thing she'd learned meant he was content in a way he didn't have the language for yet. He would learn the language. She was patient. The horse moved in the pasture behind them. The mountain stood against the sky the way it had always stood, and would stand long after all of them were gone, indifferent and enormous and beautiful in the way that large things are beautiful. Not for you, not because of you, just because they are what they are. She held James on her hip and stood next to Cole at the fence of a ranch that was his again, fully, in every record and boundary and legal document that mattered, and she let herself have it, all of it. Whatever it was and whatever it was going to be, she let herself have it. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.